we start talking about the classes and the things that we teach in these classes, I want to introduce the Pathfinder School a little bit to people who are either unfamiliar with it or have checked it out but don't really understand the Pathfinder School versus other schools. And I think that it's important to understand that when you have a business of teaching someone life-saving or life-threatening skills, that you have a responsibility to those students to make sure that they're getting correct and proper information. The way that we do that at the Pathfinder School is every instructor at the Pathfinder School has been through the Pathfinder system of classes. They have completed the e-courses, which we have online. They are like correspondent type courses that you order, phase 1 or e-course phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. You complete certain deliverables and you send those into the Pathfinder School by photojournal, essay, log journals, or photojournals. And they are checked by a Pathfinder School instructor and checked off. Those are not certifications in basic, intermediate, and advanced at the Pathfinder School. Those are an e-course that is a requirement to become an instructor, but they are something that is just set up for you in case you can't get to a class. You can do this and it will help you understand what things you need to complete doing the dirt time and research to help educate yourself and give yourself that doctorate in woodsy knowledge, as Mark Baker calls it. The other thing that I want to tell you about the Pathfinder School that kind of sets it apart from other schools, other than the fact that all of our instructors have been trained personally by me at some point in time and hand selected, is that we try very hard to make sure that we take care of our students. If you come to the Pathfinder School, you will be well taken care of. You're not going to be put in a situation that's going to be a threat to your life. We have medical personnel on staff. Every single Pathfinder instructor has to be, at least at a minimum, wilderness first aid and CPR certified. We have liability insurance in case someone gets hurt or injured beyond our control out here. And we take great strides at the Pathfinder School to make sure that your experience here is the best experience you can have at a self-reliance type or survival-based school. And depending on the class you take, depends on whether we're talking about survival or self-reliance. But we're not tactical. We don't teach tactical techniques. We don't teach military techniques. We teach what works for the woodsman now and the woodsman of the past. So let's talk about the classes that we teach and what we cover in these classes, and that will give you a better understanding of what we do. Stay with me, guys. Morning, folks. Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School. What I wanted to do today was make a quick video explaining what you learn or what we teach or the basic topics of learning in the different classes at the Pathfinder School. We get a lot of questions about this on the website and via personal emails as well. What am I going to learn? Well, we've got several ways that you can look that information up on the website. You can pull up PDF files of the class outlines as well as PDF files of recommended equipment lists. But I thought what I'd do is I would walk through it real quick on a whiteboard for you. And we're only going to talk about the 3 main classes that we teach at the Pathfinder School. We have peripheral classes that we teach in self-reliance, like the Hudson Bay Trapping class, the basic blacksmithing and self-reliance blacksmithing classes, and we also do other seminars. We're talking about doing seminars this year from the store location in Indianapolis in a classroom type environment that just covers things like the 10 C's of survivability, like a 4-hour block of instruction on a Saturday. So we plug in some of that stuff in at the store as well, and then maybe a couple leather working workshops at the Pathfinder store, maybe some archery stuff as far as how-tos and shooting. We do have a range upstairs at the Pathfinder School where you can test and shoot different bows and things like that. And we may have some archery fundamentals classes at the Pathfinder store, Self-Reliance Outfitters, as well on Saturdays. But what I want to talk to you today about is the hands-on courses that we teach. And the 3 main courses that we teach are the basic class, the intermediate class, and the advanced class. And then we have what's called a Pathfinder class, and that's like the top level of hands-on classes that we teach as far as long-term self-reliance survivability in a wilderness environment, with few items that you're carrying with you. It's not something where you take a big sled or a horse or a canoe. We're talking about items that you carry on your back at that point over a long distance. So let's talk about the basic class first. The basic class is exactly that. It is a basic fundamental understanding of lots of things. The first thing that we're going to talk about in the basic class most of the time is we'll have a discussion on the 10 C's of survivability. We'll talk about redundancies of kit. We'll talk about multifunctionality of kit items. And we'll talk about why we choose certain kit items over others. What we believe to be the best factors or the best qualities of a certain piece of gear and why. What makes it more multifunctional than this piece of kit. And we'll talk about all of those things. And then we're going to talk about knife safety. That's going to be a big first step in everything, is to talk about knife safety, because a lot of the things that you're going to do in the basic class are going to involve your knife. So we're going to talk about knife safety. Once we get done talking about knife safety, we're going to go into pretenses of fire, which goes into core temperature control, or CTC, which is surrounded by the triangle of survivability, and we'll talk about that as well, and then the triangle of fire. We'll talk about how you properly go out and collect the proper materials for a fire lay, and that's the most important thing when building fire, is the preparation to build that fire. And we'll talk about that extensively in class. We'll talk about what materials work best in eastern woodlands, how to collect them, how to find dry materials in wet weather, how to build a proper fire lay for normal conditions, for damp conditions, for conditions in the wintertime, how to build a proper fire in all four seasons, how to build a proper cook fire versus how to build a signal fire. We'll talk about everything that encompasses fire, and then we will start using different implements to start fire. And what we generally use is what I call the big 3 fire starters in the basic class. We'll talk about cigarette lighters like Bic lighters, we'll talk about ferrocerium rods, and we'll talk about magnifying glasses. And we'll do a lot of fires with our ferro rod, because the ferro rod, believe it or not, is a large failure point for most people. Anybody can grab a ferro rod and throw a few sparks on it. But to make that ferro rod optimally work for you takes certain input factors that a lot of people don't understand. When you scrape that ferro rod, it shouldn't be throwing sparks, it should be throwing lava. And we'll talk about that more in the basic class. Once we get done with that, we're going to talk about solar ignition. We'll talk about controlling embers, and that's important to solar ignition and leads into later lessons in other classes on friction fire and more primitive fires. We're going to talk about shelter. We'll talk about emergency shelter, and we'll talk about primitive shelter a little bit. And those two things are important to understand, because you should be able to carry some type of emergency shelter on your person. But if you lose that equipment, you're going to need to understand how to build a primitive shelter, because it's one of the hardest things to recreate that you can't readily carry on your person. It will generally be in a backpack or in some type of a bag connected to your body, which you might lose. If you set it off to the side in a canoe, if you've got it on the back of your horse, if you've got it, you're walking down a trail and you accidentally leave it somewhere and wander off, if you leave camp to go out on a scout or a hunt and you left your pack at camp, a lot of things can happen that separate people from their gear. The scenarios are endless. But understanding that you need to survive with what's on your body is important. And to do that, you're going to need to be able to build a primitive shelter if you have to. So we discuss that as well in the basic class. The next thing we talk about is water procurement. What we do to disinfect our water, how to collect ground source water, how to filter ground source water, and how to make it potable, whether to drink it or not to drink it. We talk about all of those things in hydration and dehydration factors when we're covering water. The next thing that we generally cover in this class, we cover obviously fire, water, shelter. Then we're going to cover a little bit about navigation and signaling. And those things can be important as well, because you've got to be able to properly signal for rescue if you have to stay where you're at to wait for someone to come find you. At the same time, basic navigation principles will help you if you only came in from a road or something and you know at least what direction that road is in, and you can walk to the road and hitchhike out, and it's only a couple miles or a few miles away, it might be better to just walk out. If you get stranded somewhere deep it may be better to signal for rescue if you've left a proper game plan. And that's part of our discussion in signal and rescue and search and rescue. We'll cover leaving a proper game plan. Critical items of information you need to leave with your family when you go on an outing somewhere so that you can be found. And we'll talk more in our search and rescue discussion, which is what we talked about last, about being found, about staying found, and about how to be found in a situation where you get lost or stranded. So these are the basic concepts that we hit on in the basic class. It's set up toward the 72-hour scenario of I went out into the woods, or I went out on an outdoor adventure. I didn't plan on staying out here overnight, but something happened to force me into that scenario. What do I need to do in the interim for a 72-hour to 4-day scenario? How can I utilize my equipment to cover all my bases and make sure that my survival priorities are met? We're also going to discuss in here somewhere between fire and knife safety. We generally discuss self-aid, and we talk about the uses of your kit to affect self-aid. We don't go deep into that because we do have a specialty class on wilderness first aid and CPR certification, as well as use of medicinal plants. But we do cover self-aid somewhat within this class as well. So these are the quick topics that we cover, some of the things that we talk about. I don't want to get too in-depth with how we discuss these things. I'd rather you come to class or watch my YouTube videos. There is some information at classes that are not on YouTube. That's just the way it is. It's more because in class things are on the fly and you remember little tips and tricks about things that you don't remember when you're shooting a YouTube video. And it's always better to learn one-on-one or by dirt time than you can learn just off the internet or by research. It takes both. It takes research and practical exercise to be able to own a skill. When you leave a basic class, you will have a basic ownership of basic skills that will keep you alive in the 72-hour to 4-day scenario.